Process of absorption. So we've got a lot of things here, but it's not terribly complicated. At least I don't think it is. Excuse me. So let's just jump right into this. So remember that we talked about how we break down carbs into sugars. Well, those sugars are called monosaccharides. So there's just simple sugars. So we've got glucose, fructose, among others. I believe there's 6 different types of simple sugars. But glucose and fructose are the ones that we primarily absorb. This is going to be a common theme today, or with this video, but absorption occurs primarily in the small intestine. So we've got glucose and galactose. Galactose is a type of simple sugar. It's taken into those enterocytes, which line the small intestine. But in order for us to bring sugar into the small intestine, we need sodium. So both sugar and sodium will be transported in at the same time. Now, if it's fructose, fructose can actually enter in by itself. It does not need sodium. Okay, so glucose and galactose need sodium. Fructose does not. Amino acids, it's similar to the sugars. So this occurs in the small intestine. There's a lot of different types of amino acid transporters, but they all need sodium. So sodium, we take in amino acids and we take sodium into the small intestine at the same time. If we don't have enough sodium, then we can't absorb amino acids. Now, these are not being pumped in, but think of it like a door that has 2 keys, okay? And remember, things move down their gradient, and so if we don't have a big enough gradient, it's less likely for that sodium key to get into the keyhole, and so it's not going to open the door for the amino acids, even if we've got a ton of amino acids. Then we've got peptides, okay? And peptides, remember, this has to do with proteins. So again, in the small intestine, but instead of going in with sodium, they actually go in with hydrogen ion. And once they get into the enterocyte, the peptides are then broken down into amino acids, and then the amino acids travel throughout the bloodstream. And then finally, we've got fats. So they're absorbed in the small intestine. Most of these are able just to enter in via simple diffusion. Okay, remember, your plasma membrane, your cell membrane is fat, so fats can diffuse through fat. They don't need a channel. But there are some that have a protein channel, so that would be facilitated diffusion. Once they get into the cell, they're transported to the endoplasmic reticulum, and from there we turn them into triglycerides. And triglycerides are the basic unit that we use to create ATP from fat, but we don't talk about that in this class. Next, we have vitamins. And now there's 2 types of vitamins. We've got fat soluble, such as A, D, E, and K. And these are absorbed in the small intestine with fats. Okay, they don't need anything to help them get in. They're able to just do that as long as we've got a gradient. And then we've got water soluble, such as B most of the B vitamins, as well as C. The exception is vitamin B12. This is only absorbed in a specific part of your small intestine, and it requires something called intrinsic factor. Okay, intrinsic factor is released, not necessarily stimulated, but released by the same cells that secrete hydrochloric acid, so those parietal cells. So without intrinsic factor, we cannot absorb vitamin B12. All right, then we've got sodium. This occurs in the small intestine. It's absorbed in the enterocytes, and like we've said earlier, this occurs along with transport of glucose and amino acids. And when sodium comes in, oftentimes hydrogen is exchanged. Okay, so we bring a sodium into the small intestine, and a hydrogen ion leaves. All right, and so then what happens is that the sodium that's in this intracellular fluid is then pumped into the extracellular fluid, okay, through the sodium potassium ATPase pump. And we haven't talked about chloride a lot in this class, but I just want to remind you that where there is sodium, there is also chloride. All right, and so with chloride, that's actually swapped with bicarbonate in the extracellular fluid. Potassium absorption occurs in the small intestine via diffusion. And what's really interesting about potassium is that much of what we take in, we actually end up getting rid of. Okay, it's something like 90% of all potassium that we absorb, we urinate out. Next, we have calcium, and so this is related to blood calcium concentration. Remember, vitamin D causes calcium absorption, and so when we have low blood calcium, we release parathyroid hormone. That causes us to take calcium from bone. It also makes it easier for calcium to be absorbed into the small intestine. I think this is the last one. Finally, we have iron. So iron moves into what we call mucosal cells. And what it does is it binds to a protein called ferritin. And this is where we store most of our iron. And when people, when they go to check to see if people have a low iron value, they're actually checking their ferritin values. Okay. And so if you've got enough iron in your blood, if you've got a high enough ferritin, then you don't do a whole lot of it. Only a small amount of it will go into that portal blood. Remember, the portal system goes from the digestive system into the liver. Now, if you have low iron, then iron is released from the small intestine into the bloodstream. Okay, so that's how the absorption of a bunch of different stuff works. I know it's not terribly exciting, but at least to kind of give you an idea of what's going on. We're going to end by talking about bile and water. Okay, and they're two separate things. So bile, which we've talked about, breaks down fats, right? Bile is made in the liver here, but it's stored in the gallbladder. Okay, bile itself is made up of salts, pigments, and cholesterol. So cholesterol is good. Just to remind you, there are some cholesterols that are good. You need a certain amount, otherwise bad things happen. So what happens is when we have fat in our small intestine, bile is released from the gallbladder, and it goes into what we call the enterohepatic circulation. Okay, and from there, bile goes into or is absorbed into the small intestine. Those bile salts break down fat, and then once they've done their job, they're reabsorbed into the bloodstream where they're transported back to the liver and ultimately to the gallbladder. And so we recycle these bile salts so that we can use them multiple times. Finally, water. So 95% of the water that we take in that enters our small intestine is absorbed, and what we don't absorb in the small intestine is absorbed in the large intestine. Okay, there is a tiny amount that we don't absorb, but that makes it so it's a lot easier to go to the bathroom. Okay, when people are constipated, that really is because they have very little water in their feces, and so that can be painful and difficult. All right. The reason that water moves is because there's a gradient, and in this case, it's due to sodium concentration. So water is being pulled out via osmosis. Sodium's not able to cross the barrier of these cells, but because there's a gradient, it sucks that water out of the small and large intestine into the intracellular or interstitial fluid, and then ultimately back into the bloodstream. Okay, so here are the 4 things I hope you're able to do after this lecture.